Perfect. Welcome back to the How You Say It podcast with myself, Graham Colgower, and I'm joined over Zoom with a Scottish music journalist who's had a career spanning more than 4 decades in the business, Billy Sloan. Billy, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm not that great with technology, but we can see each other and we can hear each other, so that's a result.
Well, through the wonders of Zoom, I mean, just, where would you have been over 40 years ago if you'd had this kind of technology to do something?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I contacted you a couple of weeks ago. We discussed, I sort of explained to you, I hadn't really, I'll be honest, I hadn't really listened to too much. My musical background, I don't really have much of an interest in music whatsoever, but I listened to a Scottish football show, Off the Ball, which is legendary in Scotland for its patter on the radio, and you were on there, and I heard some of the stories that you were talking about and some of the things that you said about your career, and I just found it absolutely fascinating, and it kind of backs up the old adage that if someone's a good storyteller, it doesn't really matter what they're telling a story about if you don't know much about it. But I was glued to my radio listening to that, and I thought I have to try and get in touch with you to connect and to try and get you on this podcast. So thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
I'd just like to start really, as we've already kind of touched on. You said a career of 45 years you've been in the music journalism business. So how did that all come about? How did that start for you?
It kind of started, the night that I went to my first ever gig. I went to my first ever gig on the 21st of October, 1971. I went to see The Who at Green's Playhouse in Glasgow. You know, that incredible building that used to stand right up at the top of Renfield Street, opposite where the pavilion still remains. And, it sounds very dramatic, but it was a kind of life-changing moment, to see my heroes, The Who, Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey, John Entwistle, and Keith Moon on that stage was just one of the most exciting things that's ever happened to me. I had queued out a few months previously in Sauchiehall Street to buy tickets. I queued out overnight. I had to beg my old man, and I mean beg my old man to let me do it with my mates. And we joined the queue at 6 o'clock on the Saturday night and queued right through until 9 o'clock on the Sunday morning until an electrical store, which for some bizarre reason sold the tickets for the venue. They opened their doors at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we were able to queue up and buy tickets. So, I mean, it was a life changer because on that night I decided that somehow I wanted to get involved in the music business. I would like to have been a swivel-hipped rock god like Roger Daltrey or Robert Plant, but I think I was realistic enough to know that I didn't have the musical talent or the good looks for that. So I thought I'm going to try and get in through journalism, and that's what I did. But it didn't happen right away. I had a variety of jobs. Most notably, I worked as a labourer in a building site, and I was making sort of pretty good money. With all the overtime and working nights and double time and treble time at weekends and stuff. I mean, I was coming up with about 70 quid a week in my hand when my mates were on, 35, 40 quid a week. So I was quite well off. But I wanted to get into journalism. It was just trying to find the way and the means to do that. And on spec, I wrote a letter to the editor of my local paper. My local paper was a paper called the Bishopbriggs and Springburn Times up in the north of Glasgow. And I wrote a letter to the editor saying, I noticed that you don't have a pop music column. I will write one for you for free as long as you put my name on it, by Billy Sloan, because I was thinking if I could build up a kind of portfolio of published articles, if I ever then went for a job in a proper newspaper, I would have something to show the editor, and that would maybe get him to employ me. And it just, by sheer coincidence, it turned out she was a great lady called Nina Young, and it turned out that she was looking for somebody to cover the Springburn area, which is quite a tough working class area, which is where I lived. And she was looking for somebody to cover that, and she offered me the job. Wow. And the only downside of that was the wages were £19 a week. And I thought, how do I go from 70 quid a week to £19 a week? That was less than a third of what I was earning. But I thought I might never get another chance. So I just bit the bullet. I had a few £100 in savings, not much, but I had a few £100 in savings. And I just thought, I'll bite the bullet. And I took the plunge. And it was the best career move that I ever made. That led to all of this. So it all started way back there, around about I think it was 76, I joined the Bishopbriggs and Springburn Times. And, in a quiet week in the paper, if you know we had a half page of the edition that we'd nothing to put in, I would kind of, you know, rustle up a pop column, you know, somebody that was coming to play in Glasgow, review a new album that had just came out, you know, a bit of information about, you know, some band or what have you, which I could do fairly easily. And that's how it started. It all started from that.
Yeah, it's quite incredible, and it's fantastic to hear about. You know, you had a vision of saying I want to be in this industry, and then you took the opportunity when it came along. I'm interested to find out, you know, the real reason we want to talk here, because it is a podcast on communication and stuff like that, is your interviewing skills and the people that you've
Yeah.
interviewed and what makes a good interview for you and how you go about doing it. But can you remember back to your first interview that you had to conduct for the newspaper or for another publication that you put out?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, I joined. It was a very small office. You know, it was just 2 rooms, and there was another male reporter who covered Bishopbriggs, and I was recruited to cover Springburn. And we had Nina Young, who was the editor, and a guy called Andy Pattison, who was the deputy editor. And then we had a woman who did all the office stuff called Isabel McGibbon. And then there was a woman who didn't work from the office. She was out in the road, you know, selling adverts. She physically went round the local shops and the local businesses trying to sell adverts. But you know, when I arrived on the first day, you know, with my shirt and tie, my suit on, you know, trying to look the part, it was just assumed that I could do the job. So literally within an hour of getting to the office, Nina Young had given me the address of a guy, you know, in Bishopbriggs who had won £1,000 on a spot the ball contest. I think it was in the Evening Times or the Evening Citizen. And she gave me his name and address, and I went up to his house with the photographer, knocked on his door, and said, "Can I come in and interview you? And you can tell me, you know, what a thrill it was to win £1,000. That was a lot of money then, and what you're going to spend the money on, and that kind of stuff." So I was thrown in at the deep end. You know, I mean, to become a journalist when you were a teenager, you could go to Napier College in Edinburgh, but I had kind of missed that. I was slightly too old for that. But I never had any formal training. You know, I literally get taken up to the top of the diving board, and somebody kicked me in the backside, and I plunged into the water below. And it was a case of sink or swim. But you know, I'd seen, you know, people being interviewed on TV. You know, you'd seen the Parkinson show. You'd seen Russell Harty. You know, I know it's a very different thing. Or you'd seen the news, so I kind of knew that it was a case of just asking the right questions at the right time and in the right order. And it was amazing how quickly you learned. I mean, of course, you made mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, and there were times when you kind of put your foot in it and said the wrong thing at the wrong time. But you know, it was great, kind of being out there, you know, learning, you know, on the job, if you like, because we never had any other option. You know, so as soon as I finished talking to the guy about, you know, his £1,000 spot the ball contest winnings, you know, we came straight back to the office. And within an hour, I was sitting at my typewriter writing the story up, and it was as fast as that.
Yeah.
And basically, you know, that's how it was. You know, it was just assumed you would be able to do it, and luckily, I had a bit of an aptitude for it.
What do you think that was, Billy? I mean, you've gone from spot the ball interviews to interviewing some of the biggest names, the biggest stars in the
Yeah,
world in the music industry, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But anyone could have just stayed in that environment, in that local newspaper environment, and carried on interviewing people who have won spot the ball or people who are upset because the bins haven't been taken away from
yeah,
local
yeah.
council for for days and days and days. But you progressed and you carried on. You carried
And there was a lot of that, Graham. You know, I mean, you know, Bishopbriggs is a fairly, or it was then, a fairly kind of affluent middle class area. It was Tory voting. You know, there was a car in the driveway. You know, back in front door, a garden. You know, maybe 2 foreign holidays a week, a year rather, 2 foreign holidays a year. So it was quite an affluent area. So our deadline day for the paper, it was a Tuesday. It was Tuesday at 12 noon, and every single bit of copy and advertising matter had to be in an envelope for 12 noon. And then I get dispatched from Bishopbriggs down to Queen Street Station to Red Star. There was a thing called Red Star. It was a kind of parcel service. And I had to send all the copy in this envelope up to a place in Arbroath where the paper was printed, because the owners, or the chain of newspapers which owned the Bishopbriggs and Springburn Times, were based in Arbroath. So every single thing had to be done and in that envelope by 12 noon, and I would get the train down to Queen Street to then send it up to Arbroath. And it was not unusual to come in on a Tuesday morning and have nothing for the front page, just because, nothing's happening. It's been a really quiet week. And we just had to sort of pluck a story out of thin air. Springburn was difficult because Springburn, only a mile down the road, was a real kind of tough, more working class, rough and ready area. And I loved living there. It was a great place. It still is. And as you said, people would think nothing of phoning up the guy at the Springburn Times, which was me, and say, right, they're getting rid of the lollipop man outside such and such a school. You're the local paper. What are you going to do about it? Or Mr. McGinty's, got a hole in his roof and he's been complaining to the council for the last 6 months, and he's got buckets down catching the water every time it rains. What are you going to do about it? So they would use the local paper as a kind of sword with which to fight authority. So it really was like that. But you were saying how did it go from that till interviewing some of the biggest stars in the world? A lot of it was being in the right place at the right time, and a lot of it was down to sheer luck. I mean, I've been working for about maybe 2 or 3 years at the Bishopbriggs and Springburn Times, and then I got a call from a group of people who were putting a magazine called Clyde Guide together for Radio Clyde. It was basically a bit like the Radio Clyde's version of the Radio Times. It had all the Radio Clyde program listings, and they had interviews with the DJs, and they had a lot of really high profile DJs at the time, like Tiger Tim and Steve Jones and Richard Park and Dougie Donnelly and Paul Coyer, Bill Smith, Dave Marshall, Jim Walk, people like that. So I managed to get a job doing that, and that lasted about, I think it was about a year or 18 months. I can't remember which. And then kind of, it kind of went to the wall. And then again, I was in the right place at the right time. Nina Young's then husband, was a guy called Noel Young, and he was the deputy editor of the Sunday Mail. And they had a pop page every Sunday that was just kind of put together by a couple of stringers from London, a couple of middle-aged guys from London. But he wanted something that was a bit more kind of, modern and up to the minute. He wanted somebody who went to gigs, who bought records, who knew the difference between, this band and that band. So he asked me if I would like to do the column. And suddenly, I was writing a column for the biggest selling paper in Scotland. I mean, in those days, the Sunday Mail was selling something like 900,000 copies every Sunday. Now, the way they calculate that is that, if a guy buys a paper, his wife reads it, and maybe one of his kids reads it, maybe one of his others. So, for every paper sold, 3.5 people read it. So, you were reaching a projected audience of something like 3 million people, which in a country with a population of only 5 million was most of the population. So, in the space of 3-4 years, I went from working in local papers to writing a column for the biggest selling paper in the country.
And I'm interested to go back. You talked about how you had to convince your dad for you to be allowed to get tickets for that Who concert when you said you were a wee bit older than the sort of teenage years where you missed the sort of Napier University days and stuff like that. What was it like trying to convince? Was there any convincing you had to do? People like your parents or your friends or your colleagues or even any people that you were with to say that you were taking this opportunity to go from earning all the money that you were earning as a labourer to then working for this local newspaper, earning what you were earning, going from what you were earning to what you were earning at the paper?
No, I mean, your mum and dad, like everybody's mum and dad, want you to get a good job, and that, in those days, get a job working in the bank or get a job, working in an office as an accountant or something like that. But that never interested me. They just were anxious that you got a job doing something that they thought was worthwhile. So when I suddenly announced that I wanted to get into journalism, that ticked a box, and they were quite happy that. But in those days, it was difficult to get in because you had to be a member of the National Union of Journalists and have a union card to work for a paper. But to get a union card, you had to have an offer of a job. So because I worked for the Bishopbriggs and Springburn Times, they were a little local paper, and they weren't that stringent enough about union membership. But once I joined the Bishopbriggs and Springburn Times, within a short period, I applied for union membership, and I got the coveted union card, which theoretically meant I could go and work for any newspaper in the country. But in terms of the money, I mean, as I say, I was earning 70 quid a week. And when I went to the Bishopbriggs Times, I get £19 a week, and I was allowed to take £1.50 from the petty cash for bus fares to go to jobs. And a Saturday I would go around all the local councillors. They would have their surgeries every Saturday morning, and I would go around all the local councillors. There was Charlie Moore for Cowlairs, and there was John Chatham for Burmulloch, and then there was a guy called Michael Martin who was for Springburn, and he went on to become the MP for Springburn, and then went on to become the Speaker of the House of Commons. He was Baron Martin of I don't know what he ended up in the House of Lords. He's sadly passed away now, but I get my bus fares to go around all these guys every Saturday morning to see what stories they had. But when I got the £19, you got it in a little brown envelope and with your name on it. And when you opened it up, you get the whole £19. There was nothing taken off for national insurance or stamp or any of that kind of stuff. It was so low, the wages, that you were under a threshold for getting, making any kind of, government contributions. So I got the whole £19, and it was tough. I'm not going to lie. As I say, I'd had a few £100 up my sleeve, but that didn't last very long. And you just cut your cloth to fit. And I was always thinking that this might lead to other things. I mean, I mentioned a moment ago that I got a job, doing the column for the Sunday Mail. And that time you get paid one shift, and one shift was £120. So there was 6 times what I was making when I was at the. And also, and you'll find this hard to believe, but it's absolutely true. Later on, when I was working for the Sunday Mail, and I also got a job in Radio Clyde, I was getting paid 120 quid a shift for doing the column in the Sunday Mail, and I was getting paid, let me think, 25 quid for doing my programme on a Thursday night in Radio Clyde. So that was a total of £145 a week, which was quite a significant sum. But I was also on the dole, because when you go to sign on the dole, you have to make yourself available to work on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Sunday doesn't count. And I did my column and I did the radio show on a Thursday. So I would go to the dole and say, the guy would say, "Have you done any work this week?" And I say, "Yeah, I did a bit of work on Thursday." So they would just score Thursday off, and I would get paid dole money for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday and Saturday. So I would be in the local dole office in Springburn, and it was all totally legitimate and above board. And I'd be queuing up there, and all the troops would be going, "That's that guy from the paper. That's him off the trolley. What's he doing here?" But it was absolutely. I was entitled to the money, and that was how it worked. So I'm a kind of cheap date. I'm really into Armani suits and flash cars and all that kind of stuff. So I went from 70 quid a week to 19 quid a week. It was tough, but I always knew that if I was able to sort of bite the bullet and go with that, it would lead to something better, and that's exactly what happened.
So I'm interested in, you've gone from this local newspaper, and then you're in the Sunday Mail, and then you're at Radio Clyde. Obviously, when you have the Sunday Mail and Radio Clyde behind you, it's a lot easier to go out and get interviews with people. They'll be probably setting some interviews up, I'd imagine, with you.
Absolutely, yeah.
You create those contacts. But before that, were you still going to gigs? Were you still trying to get access backstage to still try and interview with bands and talk to bands and musicians and things like that to keep interviewing and to keep growing that profile?
Yeah, I mean, that started with Clyde Guide, really, because in those days the papers didn't really have a dedicated music column or pop column, for want of a better term. So when I was at Clyde Guide, I would physically hoof it round all the university venues: Strathclyde University in John Street, the Queen Margaret Union up in the West End of Glasgow, Glasgow University at the bottom of Gibson Street, and just sort of talk to the social secretaries what was coming up, who was available for interview and that kind of thing. And I used to make up the listings and stuff. So I was kind of the first guy who did that. So when I then went on to work for the Sunday Mail, I'd already been doing that for a couple of years, with my Clyde Guide hat on. And as I said earlier, the Sunday Mail selling something like 900,000 copies every Sunday. That had quite a big reach, as I explained. So, a lot of the record companies would, phone up and say, we've got such and such who's bringing an album out, would you like to talk to them? Because even a little mention in the column in the Sunday Mail for a gig or for an album, that would sell records, or it would sell concert tickets. So, the Sunday Mail had quite a good reputation for that, as did Radio Clyde. I started in Radio Clyde really in 1979, and I did a program on a Thursday night from midnight until 2 o'clock in the morning. And I mean, I didn't know anything at all about presenting a radio program. I thought I knew what made a good radio program in terms of the music choices, but I just really basically sat and played a bunch of my favorite records and thought, I really love these records. Maybe if I like them, somebody else will like them. And it was as basic as that. I mean, there wasn't any kind of grand plan about, how I was going to structure the show. I just sort of sat and played the records. And in those days, you had John Peel in Radio 1 in London, obviously, but there was nobody in Scotland playing Simple Minds, U2, The Associates, Orange Juice, Aztec Camera, Joseph K, The Skids, Susie and the Banshees, all those kind of people. So, I was suddenly the one-stop shop on a Thursday night. Now, I was almost going to say I would love to hear some of those early tapes. I probably would be horrified if I heard them. I guess I would probably have ummed and ahed my way for a whole 2 hours all the way through the program. But while I wasn't the sort of polished radio presenter, I I was passionate about what I was doing, and people realised I was passionate about what I was doing. So we had a big audience because it was the only show in town.
Yeah.
And people still talk about that show to this very day. I mean, I used to get demo cassettes in. So I played Lloyd Cole, I played Hue and Cry, I played the Proclaimers, I played the Trashcan Sinatras, I played Ricky Ross of Deacon Blues, first demos, long before anybody had ever heard of them. So, and everybody used to think I was sitting like some kind of rock and roll mystic Meg, like some clairvoyant sitting looking into my crystal ball and saying, I'm going to make these guys a star. I wish I'd had that power, but it was nothing like that. It was nothing as skilled or as calculated as that. It was just a case of, I played a record. I think this is a great record. I really like it. Maybe you'll like it as well. I hope you do. And that's how it worked. That's exactly how it worked.
Wow. I mean, Glasgow is, still does to this day have quite a reputation for musicians, for bands, particularly those that there's so many stories of bands that have come into Glasgow, and this is my limited knowledge of music, so please excuse me on this. But from what I do know is there have been so many examples of bands that have come up to Glasgow and they've really enjoyed it. And it's got that kind of partisan atmosphere and things like that. And for bands starting out as well, in particular, it is kind of like a launching place for them. Take me backstage, Billy. What's it like when you're in these environments, particularly through the 70s and into the 80s, and you've got to go back? Was it a little tape recorder that you would have to take backstage?
Yeah.
So you've got a gig, maybe a band's just, is it before or after? What would the situation, what would the circumstances be like?
It would really depend. I mean, when I was at school, in my last days at school, I took something called secretarial studies and office practice. Now, what that basically was typing and, office practice. Now, you can imagine the reaction from the troops in the class when I suddenly said I was going to 2 periods of typing and they were going to 2 periods of football or something like that. I mean, the stick I got, could not be replicated in a good family podcast like this one. I mean, the language was unbelievable, but the good thing about it was I was sitting in a class, in the middle of winter when they were up the park, playing football in the freezing cold, rain and snow. I was sitting in a class with 30 pretty girls, so it kind of softened the blow a little bit. But basically, I did that with a view to thinking I want to get into journalism because, I took typing, I can touch type, I can display type, and my typing speed was superior to, a lot of the girls in the class. I've still got a pretty good typing speed. If the worst ever came to the absolute worst, I don't know if anybody employs typists anymore, but I could get a job as a typist. I'm pretty good. When I worked in the building site, I enrolled in Strathclyde University in a shorthand course, and I went to night classes. I think it was twice a week. I went to night classes to learn how to do shorthand, thinking that that would be handy and I was going to need that. But I couldn't really cut it, to be honest. I couldn't really hack it because it was a bit too much like going back to school,
Mm.
and I never really sort of got to grips with it. So, tape machines were the next best thing. So you would go along with your little tape machine. I would have a little cassette recorder and just press play and record, and sometimes you would go and interview a band at the sound check in the afternoon, or more often than not, you would interview them after the show, when they were a bit more relaxed and they got the show out of the way. But that's how it works. When I started in 1979, I think the first big star interview I did was Chrysalis Records took me to Hamburg in Germany to interview the Irish guitar legend Rory Gallagher, and I'd never even been abroad. I had to apply for a passport, and they took me to Hamburg and interviewed one of the greatest guitar players in the history of rock. So that was probably the first, big interview that I remember pressing play and record, and that happening. So tape recorders are great because it's a great record of the interview. The problem that you have with that is you've got to come back and transcribe the tape and then kind of knock it into some kind of shape, which is quite time consuming. There's not really a quick way of doing that, but that's how everybody does it now. You just tape the conversation, and that's what you have as a backup, so that, if somebody then talks, I never said that in the interview, you say, well, actually you did.
Aye.
And you can play the tape back. So, that was how it worked. It was just a case of recording the conversation. I mean, I've been in a few occasions where, thankfully, maybe only 4 or 5 in my whole period of time as a music journalist, where you've got out of an interview. I remember I went to interview, I think it was Fish of Marillion once at the EMI Records headquarters in Manchester Square in London. And I get out of the interview after about an hour, and I walked around the corner and I spun it back and I pressed play, and there was nothing in the tape.
Oh, no.
I had done something wrong, and the tape was completely blank. So what you then had to do was I had to go around the corner to a cafe and sit in the cafe just with my notebook and try and unload my brain onto the pages of my notebook and try and remember, what he said. But, obviously you never got anywhere near the accuracy that you would have had done if it had been a tape machine. I was once interviewing Paul McCartney. I think it was maybe the first time, and I was so kind of in awe and nervous about sitting opposite the guy from the Beatles that for the first 2 questions, I didn't have the tape machine switched on. And I looked in the wee cogs weren't going round, and I just about had a heart attack. And then I had to switch on, and he kind of spotted me doing it, and he went, "Are you okay?" And I went, "Yeah, I'm fine, I'm fine." But he kind of knew that I'd missed the first couple of questions. So, thankfully, touch wood, times like that were few and far between.
I'm interested to you talked about the lessons that you had to learn, and you had to learn them quick when you were on the job. Um, back in your days at the local newspaper and stuff. What's the sort of harshest lesson you've mentioned about making sure you remember your press and record, or that things are working? But when it comes to actually when you're doing an interview with somebody, can you remember what was the quickest or harshest lesson that you had to learn when you're going into somebody else's environment? You mentioned about going down to record companies, you're backstage, or even going into somebody's house. You're in that person's own space. And
Yeah.
I personally find that could be straight away from an interviewing prospect, you're almost on the back foot because you're in their domain, their environment. So when it comes to trying to get the best out of them, was there any key lessons that you learned early on in your career that really helped you and propelled you into being able to continue to do these interviews?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big lesson, which I still employ to this day, is to, and it sounds so basic that it's and so obvious that it's amazing that I'm even saying it. But I think the thing is that you just do your homework.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're going to be going into a room with an artist of the stature of Mick Jagger or Paul McCartney or Bruce Springsteen or Elton John or David Bowie or Rod Stewart or Diana Ross or Dolly Parton or Neil Diamond or Michael Stipe of REM or Bono of U2, you better know your stuff, because, these guys are professionals. They're used to dealing with professional people who act in a professional and responsible manner. So if you go in there and you're trying to busk it, very, very quickly they're going to spot that, you know, A, you don't know what you're talking about, and B, you're ill equipped to do the interview kind of thing. And not only is that kind of not only do you leave yourself really wide open by not doing your homework, but it's really kind of unprofessional. You know, if you're going to sit in a room with a guy like Mick Jagger or a guy like Paul McCartney, two of the founding fathers of British rock and roll and world rock and roll music, you know, you should pay them the courtesy of knowing your stuff. So I always do my homework, always, without fail. I mean, probably the guy who I've interviewed more than any other person is Jim Kerr of Simple Minds.
Mm.
Now, Jim Kerr is one of my closest friends in the world. We've been in each other's houses. We've been on holiday together. We've been out for dinner. I was friendly with his late mother and father. You know, he's one of my closest friends in the whole world, right? I probably know more about Simple Minds than he does. But every time I interview him, and I did it quite recently, I'm sitting up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning with all my notes and you know, getting all my dates and times and names and places, because, you know, I afford him the same level of respect and courtesy that I would afford somebody that I was interviewing for the first time. And
Mm.
you don't want to go into a room with Mick Jagger or David Bowie or Paul McCartney and know your stuff, because they will spot it a mile away. And you end up starting to flounder.
Mm.
And, you know, you can get a situation, and I'm not talking about these three guys particularly, where you say, you know, what about that time you said such and such? And they'll say, I didn't say that. And you say, well, yeah, you did. You said it in the New Musical Express in 1979. And you've got to be able to sort of, you know, be armed to the teeth of, you know, with your information and your facts. Because if they say, I didn't say that, you've got to say, well, I can contradict you and
Yeah.
say that here's the evidence. And you know, I take your point about getting into their space. You know, you a lot of the time you're going into a room in a hotel room, which is
Mm.
their suite, or you're going into a room in a record company. So you're going into their environment. So all the more reason why you've got to be prepared. I mean, I would never, ever, ever go into an interview where I didn't have all the facts and figures at my fingertips. I mean, two of the career highlights for me have been I hosted two events, one at the Armadillo in Glasgow in 2015, and one at a hotel in London in March of 2023, the Intercontinental Hotel in London, and it was an evening with Al Pacino, the actor who played Michael Corleone in The Godfather. And the 2015 one at the Armadillo, which was the first one, I get quite nervous before an interview, particularly a radio interview. But this was an interview on stage in front of 3,500 people who had spent a minimum of 150 quid a ticket. And I didn't want people who'd spent 150 quid a ticket to say Pacino was great, but the guy who was talking to him didn't know what he was talking about.
Mm.
So I spent 10 weeks sitting up to 3 o'clock in the morning every night, 7 nights a week, watching all the movies, you know, Panic in Needle Park, Serpico, Donnie Brasco, Scent of a Woman, Carlito's Way, the three Godfather movies. I watched them all. I read up extensively on Pacino. So by the time I got to meet Pacino in 2015, I could probably have gone on Mastermind with Al Pacino as a specialist subject, and I would have got a good mark. I
Yeah.
knew that much about him. And then I did him recently in 2023. It was a dinner for 2,200 people at the Intercontinental Hotel in London, and it was a bit easier the second time because they remembered me, and you know, we had a bit of a relationship. But you know, you can't sit on a stage with Michael Corleone and know your stuff,
Yeah.
because it's not only insulting to him, but it's insulting to the people who spent a lot of money buying tickets to hear what the great man's got to say. So, you know, on both occasions, the interviews couldn't have gone any better, and he really responded to me. And there was a few times where, you know, he said, "Oh, you know, I love your questions. You know, you really keep me on my toes," and that kind of stuff. And that's what it's about. I mean, because a good interview should just be like a conversation like you and I are having at the moment, that you allow people to kind of eavesdrop on. It should just be a chat between two pals, you know, in which you can get information from. You know, it shouldn't be a formal, you know, speak your weight machine. tell me, Graham, you know, what do you think of such and such? And you answer it, and then tell me, Graham, what do you think? It should be a bit more kind of relaxing that. And there's times when it can go totally wrong. I mean, I remember in 2006, I went to interview the Rolling Stones in Porto in Portugal. They were playing the football ground of Porto FC on their Bigger Bang tour. And it was a dream job. We got 20 minutes with Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Charlie Watts, and Ronnie Wood. Now, of the four of them, you probably want to do Charlie Watts, God rest him, number 3, because of the four of them, he's probably the shyest guy and not as good a talker as the other 3 are. But just the way the cards were dealt, Charlie Watts was the first interview, and I thought, right, there's nothing we can do about it. We just need to do him first. So he was brought into the room. He sat down. He's a pretty sort of laid back, reserved kind of guy. And I said, Charlie Watts, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. Welcome to Radio Clyde. I was doing it for Radio Clyde. And I said, you know, you're on a Bigger Bang tour, which was the name of the tour that they were on at that time. You know, you've done so many great tours over the years. What makes this tour different? You know, what makes this tour different from what's gone before? And he kind of went, well, you know, I don't really know. You know, I don't know what I would say about that. I don't really know how I would answer that. Well, I don't really know what would make it different from what's gone before. I guess what would make it different would be that this is the first tour I've done since I recovered from throat cancer. Now, I'm going to ask him about throat cancer, but that's like question number 12. I'm going to kind of build up to it. But as soon as he introduced it, I had to leapfrog 11 questions and go straight in, because I can't then start talking to him about other things. And then 15 minutes later, go, right, tell me about, you know, what happened when you had throat cancer. So he introduced it, and I had to sort of, you know, I had a sort of rough sort of, you know, game plan for where I wanted the interview to go. But as soon as he introduced that right away, we just had to go in and focus on the throat cancer. And, you know, he told me some incredible stuff, how he'd gone to the hospital, and as soon as he heard the C word, he thought, this is it, I'm going to die. And, you know, he thought that was the end of the road for him. And luckily he survived that. Sadly, it caught up with him a few years later. But, you know, during an interview, you've got to kind of react to what's happening during the interview. I mean, I can go into an interview with a rough kind of route map of where I would like to start and where I would like the interview to go and where it would end up. But a lot of the times when you're halfway through the interview, depending on what they say or what they don't say, you've got to sort of cut your cloth to fit and, you know, adjust the direction that you're heading in to accommodate, you know, what the other person is saying.
I think it's true. I think when I see a lot of interviews or listen to people who you know have done it for years and years and years, and I'm still learning myself, there's nothing worse than when someone says, "Oh, you've already answered my next 2 questions in the answer." And I think being too structured and keeping yourself with too many boundaries to the list of questions that you have, so you've got to let it flow. And it's interesting you're talking there about when you have a situation where you've got 20 minutes with a person.
Yeah.
You've got to try and get something out of that 20 minutes. Now, I'm sure in your career as well, you've not been the only person that's been interviewing that particular person that day. So it might just be a case of it's your 20 minutes. And then you've had somebody else has been 20 minutes before you and somebody else will be 20 minutes after you. And I can probably imagine for some of these, you know, that people often talk about, oh, such a shame for these precious superstars. They've got to sit for a whole day on the money that they're getting answering questions so their fans can hear about them. But I can still imagine it's a long day if you're sitting there and particularly having to answer the exact same type of questions. So the kind of double-edged question I've got for you here is, first of all, what kind of things can someone do where if you have just a limited period of time and you've got to try and get as much out of that person as possible, and you've maybe never even met that person before, how can you go about, or how can somebody who's maybe listening to this go about doing that? And then secondly as well is, has there ever been a situation where you've walked in a room and you know that person just, they can't be bothered with you being there, and you know you've got 20 minutes to try and get information out of them and try and make your interview stand out or be a little bit different from the other ones that they've had and the other ones that they'll have for the rest of the day?
Let's take the second part of that first then. I remember, you know, and I mentioned it in my book, I went to interview Liza Minnelli, you know, who's probably one of the last of that kind of breed of Hollywood star, you know, the daughter of Judy Garland and film director Vincent Minnelli. And I went to interview her at the Savoy Hotel in London, which is quite intimidating in itself, walking into such a grand place as that hotel in the Strand. And I was kind of the 12th interview of that day. I think she was promoting an album called, I think it was Results, that she'd recorded with the Pet Shop Boys. It's a great record. And the problem is that if you're number 12 of 12 interviews that day, as you quite rightly say, she's being asked about the album. So, obviously there's going to be a few questions in there that she's been asked 11 times previously before you get to her. And it's never a good sort of position to be in. The last interview of the day, she's been sitting there for hours. She's been asked all these questions over and over again. She just really wants to go away and go for dinner or go out with friends or something like that. But you've got to get something out of her. So what I did was, you're Scottish, so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. When you go to visit somebody, you take them like a wee box of sweets, or you take them a bottle of wine, or you take them something. I went to Harrods, and they had a great cookie shop in Harrods, and I bought her a box of cookies, and I got her to put the lovely Harrods red ribbon round them. And I walked into the suite, and there she was, Liza Minnelli, larger than life. And I said, Liza, I says, I'm from Scotland. I says, and when you go visiting somebody, you don't go empty-handed. I says, so I bought you a box of cookies. I said, and you can get anyone you like in the box, apart from the oatmeal and raisin. That's mine. I says, so put the kettle on. We're going to have a cup of tea and some cookies. And she was she was screaming the play, and that kind of broke the ice a wee bit, because it was a little bit different. I'm sure that the 11 previous guys hadn't done that, and I got on great with her, to such an extent that I was told not to ask her about our mother, Judy Garland, but we were getting on so well that I just thought, I can go for it here, and I said, you're the daughter of a very famous, legendary Hollywood mother. How do you think, what do you think your mother would have thought of the incredible success you've had, winning an Oscar for Cabaret and touring concert venues around the world and making records and touring with Frank Sinatra and all that kind of stuff. And she answered the question, she just said, my mum would have been really proud of me, and I hope she would have been happy that I was successful. And so you just get, another time I went to interview Celine Dion in New Orleans. And again, I was doing my homework, and part of that involved looking up clips of Celine Dion on YouTube. And I saw a press conference where halfway through the press conference, she talked about coming to Scotland. And she went, I love Scotland. It was great. I had a great time there. It's such a beautiful place. And I stayed in this lovely hotel in Glasgow, and they had these incredible homemade butter cookies. And I just became addicted to the butter cookies. Now, what she meant was shortbread.
Aye.
She was talking about shortbread. So I found out, I did a bit of detective work and found out that she was living when she came to Glasgow, she lived in a boutique hotel in the West End of Glasgow called One Devonshire Gardens. So I went across to the manager and I said, look, I'm going to interview Celine Dion in a couple of weeks in New Orleans. She was raving about these butter cookies. What she's actually talking about is shortbread. Yeah, my chef makes his own shortbread. I said, would there be any possibility that he could make me a little box up and I can take them to her? So they made me this lovely box of shortbread, and they put a lovely ribbon around it. And I don't know how I managed to get it all the way from Glasgow to Heathrow to New Orleans without being smashed to smithereens. But I walked into the dressing room of the Houston Superdome, 75,000 capacity Houston Superdome. No, Houston Superdome, New Orleans Superdome, my mistake, in New Orleans. And I said, I hear you like butter cookies. I brought you some. And she opened the box there and then, and we start eating shortbread, doing the interview. So you can kind of do things like that, which can sort of make it a little easier. What was the first part of the question again?
Well,
Just
you've kind of answered both in the sense about when you've only got that 20-minute
But
period.
you've only got 20 minutes. I mean, with David Bowie, I interviewed him 7 times. And in most of those occasions, you only got like 5 minutes. And it was 5 minutes.
Mhm.
And, you've just got to steam in. Now, 5 minutes doesn't sound a lot, but 5 minutes is 5 good questions. And 5 good questions is 5 good answers. So it's really up to me to come up with 5 good questions that I think is going to kind of stimulate him, to give me a great answer back. And touch wood, luckily, of all the times I've ever interviewed him, I don't think I come away thinking, oh, that was a waste of time. We always get something from him, always get something from him. And I had a really good relationship with him. He kind of knew me, and We talked a lot over the years, and as I say, interviewed him 6 times face to face and once on the phone. I mean, when I interviewed him on the phone, that was probably the best one. I get 15 minutes with him, and he just brought out an album called Reality. And in the lyrics of Reality, there was a lot of references to New York, which had become his adopted home. He moved over there and lived a very normal life in a flat in an apartment called in Lafayette Street in Soho, in Lower Manhattan. And I said, so you've really embraced New York. How did it feel? How did you feel when your adopted home came under terrorist attack, in 9/11? And he said, well, I was in a hotel, I was in a recording studio in upstate New York working on a record. He says, and Iman, his wife, phoned him, and he said that the reason that they bought the apartment was that one of the reasons that they bought the apartment was that the kitchen window looked out straight into the Twin Towers. They had an uninterrupted view of the Twin Towers. And the man, his wife, phoned him and said, I've just seen a plane going to the Twin Towers. And while he was talking to her, the second plane went into the second tower. And at that time, their daughter was only a little toddler, Alexandra. And he said, look, get some clothes, get the pram, get the baby, get out of there. We're under attack. We're under attack. So, just things like that, very unexpected, just kind of land in your lap. But you've just got to steam in and get it done. I did another great interview once with Gary Newman. He was appearing at the Queen Margaret Union on some tour. I can't even remember what it was. It was just a sort of fairly ordinary interview to get a few quotes for the column, my weekly column. And then and then he started talking about what a difference having a family had made to him, because he married a girl who was in his fan club. They're still married to this day, and they tried to start a family, and it hadn't quite worked. And then I think they went down the IVF route, and suddenly, bingo, they hit gold, and they had a baby daughter. And then, a couple of years after that, they had another baby daughter, and he talked about how, what a difference that made to his life, and having these two little, beautiful little daughters in his life, and it was the most heartwarming interview I've done in a long time. And I said to him at the end of it, I said, I really wasn't expecting this, Gary. You've spoken about your wife and your daughter in the most loving way. Do you have a photograph of your daughters and your wife that you would be happy to share with us? Because a lot of them like to keep that kind of thing private. And he went, yeah, I've got a couple of pictures I'd be happy for you to use. So I gave him the picture editor's email address and said goodbye, never thinking I'd hear from him ever again. And about 20 minutes later, the picture editor shouted me over and he said, I've got an email from Gary Newman here with 4 pictures of him, larking about with his daughters and rolling about in the carpet with his girls and going out a walk with. And it was one of the best stories we ever did in the paper, just because it was so unexpected. So things like that happen. But, when you've only got a short period of time, and most of these guys, how many times has Paul McCartney been asked about George Harrison and John Lennon? How many times has he been asked about the Beatles? How many times has he been asked about, splitting for the Beatles and forming Wings? How many times has he been asked, is yesterday his greatest song, or has he still got to write his greatest song? He's probably been asked every single question I've probably asked him. 2,000 other journalists have probably asked him the same question, but he is so professional that he always makes it sound as if he's being asked it for the first time. And that's the skill on his part. And the skill on your part is to try and sort of pitch it to him as if you're asking him that question for the first time. So it's a bit of a kind of two-way street. It always works out. I mean, there are very few interviews where you come out thinking, Christ, what was that all about? I'm not going to get a line out of this. It's the guy was as dull as dishwater, or I didn't ask him the right questions or something. But for every one of them, you've got a Rod Stewart or an Elton John or a Mick Jagger or a Paul McCartney or a Dolly Parton or a Bruce Springsteen. So it kind of balances the books quite a bit.
I mean, it sounds to me, and it sounds very difficult to have to try and do, but I mean, is there an element of trying to build a rapport with somebody who you're having an interview with in advance of the interview, or even during the interview. But in 5 minutes, that must be such a difficult way to do it. So, is there any skills, techniques? I know that body language, we've talked about that on this show quite a lot of times about, if someone walks into a room looking miserable, it's going to have an effect on the people that are around.
Yeah.
Or,
I mean, if you walk in and you're aggressive or you're kind of, and you don't ask the tough questions right away, I mean, we interviewed Johnny Cash once, and he was going to talk about the time he'd spent in the Betty Ford clinic, where he'd been popping pills and drinking 2 bottles of bourbon a day, and beating his wife up and all that kind of stuff. And he went into the Betty Ford clinic to try and sort himself out. Now, he was prepared to talk about all of that. So you don't walk in right at the start and go, right, tell me about what happened to you when you were in the Betty Ford clinic. You kind of work your way up to it. And also, in terms of having a rapport, I mean, I've interviewed people like, I mean, Bowie, God rest him, he knew me. And, so we had a bit of a rapport. Alice Cooper, I've had Alice Cooper on my radio show about 4 or 5 times, and I got on great with him. The same with John Lydon of the Sex Pistols and Public Image Limited. People that over the years you built up a relationship with, like the guys from Spandau Ballet or Duran Duran or Boy George or Simple Minds or all the Scottish bands, Deacon Blue, people like that. So sometimes you've already got a rapport. They know you and you know them. I mean, a good example of that is Lulu. Lulu's become quite a good pal of mine, and I've interviewed her loads of times, and she always says, I'll always be interviewed by you because it's always a pleasure, and you always know what you're talking about. Rod Stewart's another one. I asked him for a quote from a book, and he said, I've known you for years, and you've always done me proud. I owe you. That was said. I owe you. So, and you can only do that through time and through treating people professionally and in a good way. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that you've always got to, be nice to them and not be critical of them. I've been critical of loads of people over the years if I thought it was justified. But you do build up a rapport with people, and I mean, if I was interviewing Rod Stewart later this week, for instance, he would be pleased to see me, and he knows me, and we've done loads of stuff over the years. So it wouldn't be like he was being asked questions by somebody who's a total stranger. Bono from U2 gave me a lovely quote from a book, and we got it at the very last minute, and that's simply because I interviewed him for the first time away back in 1981 when U2 played at Strathclyde University, and I interviewed him after the show in the gents' toilet in level 5 of Strathclyde University, simply because it was the only place quiet and echoey enough that we could get to do a radio interview. And I've had a great relationship with the guys in U2 over the years, a great personal relationship with them. They've always welcomed me into the U2 inner circle. And, as I say, when we were putting the finishing stages of my book together that just came out in September, we were quite literally ready to press the button and go to the printers. And at the very last minute, I didn't think we would get it because, of course, U2 have just started their first ever residency in the Sphere in Las Vegas. So they were locked away on a sound stage rehearsing for that, with the do not disturb sign on the door. But Bono still found 10 minutes to clear a space and go and write me a little message for my book. And I could tell that it was him that wrote it, but it wasn't a case of, some PR person had written it and said, can I stick your name on this? Can I stick your name on this? I can tell by the language that he used that it was him that actually wrote it. Now, this guy's the lead singer in one of the biggest bands, if not the biggest band in the world at the moment, yet he still found 10 minutes to write a little message that I could put on the front of my book. And, that only comes from years of building a relationship and earning the trust of people of that stature. And the other thing I would say as well, Graham, is that, a lot of these big stars, at the end of the day, they're just guys. They're surrounded by managers and security people and promo people and publicists and stylists and, minders and all that kind of stuff. And it's those people that cause the problems. If you can actually get to the guy or the female, whoever it is, they're just people. And as long as you sort of treat them with respect and treat them in a professional manner, they will respond to that. But if you go in there and you don't know what you're talking about and you're flippant and you're kind of just no acting in a professional manner, you ain't going to get anywhere. You ain't going to get anything decent in the interview, and you certainly ain't going to build up any kind of relationship with them.
Billy, I have to say, I've got a couple more questions, but I just have to say, I mean, I'm pinching myself hearing some of the stories that you're telling me. You must be immensely proud to have been able to achieve that. I mean, you're talking about Bono and seeing the Sphere stuff, and it's not just Bono; it's all the other people as well. The
Yeah.
names you mentioned to have, where you've started in your career and to where you've come from and to what you've got. It must be immensely proud for you to be able to sit there and think, someone's going to Bono's going to personally write you a note for your book, and people are personally going to say thank you for the work that you've done for them and you're doing your job just to interview them. For somebody who just decided, I want to get involved in being I want to be involved in the music industry, to have had what you've had, it must be a hugely proud moment for you.
It is, because, as I say in my book, it's called One Love, One Life.
Mm.
And apart from my family, it is what my one love and my one life, was music. And, to have people of the stature of, Jim Kerr has written the foreword of the book, and Bono's written a message. We use a little bit of it in the front, but we use the full quote inside. We have quotes from Rod Stewart, from Paul Buchanan of the Blue Nile, from Peter Capaldi, the musician and the actor who was in the thick of it. And he was Doctor Who, of course. We've got Fran Healy of Travis, Lulu, Midge Ure, the guy who only wrote one of the biggest selling singles of all time, Do They Know It's Christmas, and masterminded Live Aid. Also in there is Gary Newman. Who else? The Proclaimers. I can't think of who else is in, but people of that stature. And I've been a music journalist and broadcaster for 45 years, and that gave me the machinery to write this book. I sat for 6 months at this very desk where I'm sitting talking to you at the moment, on this very computer that we're having the chat on. And I wrote the book. It took me 6 months, and there was days where you would look at the computer and nothing would come out. Or you would look at the computer and you type all this stuff and you'd read it the next day and think, what a load of nonsense, and you would press delete and just wipe it all out. So, you kind of really had to be in the mood for doing it. But I kind of got there. I've never missed a deadline in my life, and the deadline was on the 1st of June, and I made it.
Yeah.
So that was good. But although, as I said, being a journalist and a broadcaster gave me the machinery to write this book, it was really fueled by the fact that I'm a music fan. I'm a music fan first and foremost, and this book is very much written from the view of a music fan. And I don't make any bones about it. It can sometimes be a bit uncool to admit that you're a music fan, but I celebrate that. I used to share an office with a guy, and when we were having an argument, he would say, your problem is you're nothing but a fucking fan with a typewriter. Now, he thought that was a kind of venomous put down. That was the biggest compliment he could ever have paid me. Because I think when you stop being a fan and you get, been there, seen it, done it, got the T-shirt, you start yawning. Just walk off the park, you know what I mean? Don't try and force it, go and do something else, go and lie and have a snooze on the couch or go to the movies or walk the dog or something like that. Just don't force it. But, I still get excited. I'm just as excited now. In the past few weeks, we interviewed Pete Townsend of The Who, we interviewed Kevin Rowland of Dexys Midnight Runners, we interviewed Alice Cooper. I just interviewed Paul Jones from Manfred Mann. Last week, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Jim Kerr and Charlie Burchill from Simple Minds, and I still get excited about that, right? Because I'm a fan first and foremost. And I think when you stop being a fan, you should just stop, because I've been very fortunate in that I've got to sort of meet or interview most of my heroes. I mean, I'm a big boxing fan, and I've interviewed Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Mike Tyson. I've interviewed Sugar Ray Leonard. Who else have I interviewed? Football, I've met and spoke to Pele, Kenny Dalglish, Maradona, that kind of stuff. Now, if you're a fan, it doesn't get any better than that. And I'm quite happy to be a fan. It's kind of a bit uncool to admit that, because you're supposed to be above all that. But, right from the start, when I went to interview somebody, and at the end of it, I would get my picture taken with them.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was that the editor of the Daily Record, who was a great guy called Bernie Vickers, he was aware of what I said earlier. All these stars had, a protective cocoon around him of managers and minders and publicists and stylists and record company promo people, and you couldn't get to them. But if I went to interview Paul McCartney, he insisted that I get a picture taken with Paul McCartney, and that proved that while you can't get to them, our guy can get to them.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of the time you pick up a paper these days and it says, Joe Bloggs interviews Madonna or something, and he's never actually spoken to Madonna. He's maybe had some paragraphs of quotes from a publicist, and he's got some information off the internet, and he's cobbled something together and built it up into an interview. Call me old-fashioned, but I think if you're going to interview somebody, you should actually sit and talk to him. So Bernie, the editor, who was a great guy, he insisted that I get my picture taken with the star that I was interviewing, so that we could prove 100% decisively that our guy had met Paul McCartney or Mick Jagger or David Bowie or Rod Stewart or Elton John, right? And the other selfish thing was, I thought, you're maybe only going to get one chance in a lifetime to be sitting in a room with somebody of that stature. Luckily with McCartney, it's been 4 times. With Mick Jagger, it's been 3 times. With Bowie, it was 7 times. With Rod Stewart, it's been numerous times. Elton John, it's been 4 times. But I always took the point of view that if you were going to be sitting in a room with Bruce Springsteen, you would be insane not to have some kind of record of it. And I just started collecting them, and I would ask them for an autograph, and they would look at me and think, "Who's the autograph for?" Expecting me to say it's my sister's pals, Lee Cousins, Paperboy's nephew. And I would say, well, it's for me. And they would kind of look as if to say, normally, because all the London guys never did that. They never did that, because they thought they were bigger stars than the stars they were sitting interviewing. So they would never ask for an autograph or ask for a photograph. But, I always did it, and I make no bones about it. I'm a fan, and I remain a fan. And I think, as I say, when you stop being a fan, is when you should just stop.
I mean, that's fascinating here. One of the last questions before we move on to our sort of three fundamentals that I usually ask all the guests. You've mentioned a few names, and I've got written down here in my notes: divas and or volatile characters slash situations that you found yourself in. I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot. It'd be rude for me to say, give us a name of this.
I'm more than happy to tell you. Well, I in the book, I do a whole chapter called "I Don't Want to Talk About It," and it's about the interviews that kind of went pear-shaped, and taxi drivers in particular. You're in the back of a taxi, and they look in the mirror and they never go, "Who's the best interview you've ever done?" So who was the worst? Who was the worst? they always want to know the blood and guts. And the worst interview was Chuck Berry. Right. He was coming to play in Glasgow, in Irvine rather. I think it was 1989 or something. And we fixed up an interview with him, and I went down to talk to him at a hotel right next to Glasgow Airport, the Excelsior it was called then. And Bernie Vickers, the editor who I mentioned earlier, he said, right, we're holding the front page for this. We're going to use a big picture of the king of rock and roll back in Scottish soil, and then we're going to turn into page 4 or 5, and we're going to have 2 pages with your interview in it. And I went down to interview Chuck Berry, and he was horrible. He didn't want to do the interview, despite the fact that it had been arranged 2 months previously, and he just was monosyllabic. And and at one point he pointed to the photographer. The photographer was sitting with his cameras and all his lenses and stuff, and he went, "Who's that?" And I went, "It's a photographer." And he went, "No photographs." And I went, "Why not?" He says, I'm not dressed yet." Now, he looked amazing. He had the slick slick back black hair. He had the sort of lovely shirt with the sort of bootlace tie with a little, metal clasp. He had the sort of buckskin waistcoat. He had the tight sort of faded jeans and the cowboy. But he just looked exactly like Chuck Berry. And I said, "You look fantastic." And he pointed to his head. He said, "You don't understand. I'm not dressed up here yet." So he wouldn't let us take his picture. And then when I started interviewing him, it was like, I think the first question I said to him was like, "How does it feel to be back in Scotland?" Just to get the ball rolling. He went, "Well, I don't know. I've just got here." That was probably his most expansive answer. And then it was like, "Yep, no, yep, no, yeah, no." So after about 10 minutes of this, he just treated me like dirt. And this was one occasion where being a fan kind of was to my detriment, because at the end of this guy, treating me like shit for 10 minutes for no reason whatsoever other than he was just being really nasty. I kind of asked him for his autograph. I had a picture of Chuck Berry doing the duck walk with his guitar and asked him for his autograph. And he kind of grudgingly scribbled his name across it and then kind of threw him with the pen down in my lap and stormed off. And I always regretted that because I thought, you've treated me like dirt for 10 minutes and then I've indulged you by asking you for your autograph. And I say in the book that it's long been my, what's the word I'm looking for? Long been my intention to profit from Chuck Berry in some way. Because if you go on eBay these days, for a signed Chuck Berry picture, you'd probably be able to get 250 quid for it or something. But as I say in the book, I don't even have the enthusiasm to go in and get it out the drawer and photograph it and list it and sell it to some fanatical Chuck Berry fan and get 250. I can't even be bothered, So you would get instances like that. I interviewed Mariah Carey once, and she was a dead loss. Had to sit about 30 feet away from her in a room full of all her flunkies fussing over her and whispering round about her and stuff like that. And that was a disaster. I interviewed Damon Albarn of Blur, and I didn't particularly like him very much. MC Hammer walked up and down the dressing room looking in the mirror to see if his balloon trousers were, look cool in the mirror. Mick Hucknall, I didn't really fancy Mick Hucknall very much. But, as I say, for every one of them, you get an Elton John or a Rod Stewart or a David Bowie or a Paul McCartney or a Bruce Springsteen or a Dolly Parton or a Diana Ross. So it balances the books.
Has there been one? Sorry, keep going on about this. I'm just here. Has there been one where you've maybe done your homework and you've maybe heard that somebody's maybe been a little bit of a notorious character, difficult with interviews, and you've walked in and you've found that they're the complete opposite, or you've it's maybe started slowly, but you've managed to turn it around, and it's turned out to be a really successful interview?
Yeah, I mean, I remember in 2003, September of 2003, in fact, I can remember the date. It was the 3rd of September, 2003. The Rolling Stones played 2 shows at the SECC in Glasgow, one on the 1st of September and one on the 3rd of September. And a story appeared in one of the Scottish newspapers saying that they had a picture of a roadie carrying these 2 silver suitcases into the gig. And the story that was printed in this Scottish paper said that the Rolling Stones had bought 2 defibrillators. I didn't even know what a defibrillator was then. In case, they were all getting on a bit, Charlie Watts, Ronnie Wood, Keith Richards, and Mick Jagger. And, they bought these 2 defibrillators so that if halfway through Honky Tonk Woman, Charlie Watts suddenly had a heart attack and fell off his drum stool, they could, get the defibrillator and give him 25,000 volts off his jacksie. And, he would be able to climb back onto the drum stool for, Street Fighting Man, the next number. Or if Keith Richards conked out halfway through, Sympathy for the Devil, they gave him a quick blast of the defibrillator and he'd be back on his feet in no time. So Keith Richards went ballistic, absolutely ballistic about this. And I said to the guy who's the tour director, why don't you get them to do an interview? No, he'll not do an interview. They don't do interviews. You know that. I was sitting in the office and I suddenly got a phone call saying, be in the FCC in half an hour and Keith will talk to you. So, I mean, I never really had any time to do any preparation, and I was going to interview Keith Richards for the first time, the Keith Richards. So along there, and I think it's fair to say that I was petrified because he's got such a formidable reputation. And the girl who was working for the band said, what's wrong? I said, I'm just a bit nervous about getting into. She says, he's a pussycat. You'll love him. You'll absolutely love him. I says, but it's Keith Richards. She says, he'll be fine. So I get taken into his dressing room, and there he was, and he was wearing this big hat, and I think he had a T-shirt with a skull and crossbones on it or something like that. And he was playing this sort of heavy dub reggae music on this ghetto blaster that was the size of a walk-in wardrobe. And I sat and interviewed him. And I thought, I'm going to get eaten alive here. And he was great, because he just, he wanted to talk. And I said to him, something always happens when you come to Scotland, Keith. Why do you think that is? And he said, well, yeah, because the Stones were a Scottish band, man. And I went, what? He said, yeah, we're a Scottish band, we're Scottish. And I thought he was taking the piss. And then he explained himself. The Rolling Stones, and I don't know if you'll be too young to even know this, but the Rolling Stones were started in 1962 by Brian Jones, a guitar player, and a piano player called Ian Stewart, who came from Pittenweem in Fife.
Really?
Yeah, that's a true story. Ian Stewart. So they started the band, and then they recruited Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, and then they recruited Charlie Watts, and then they recruited Bill Wyman. And Ian Stewart actually was a full member of the Rolling Stones in the early 60s. There was 6 of them. There wasn't 5 of them, there was 6 of them. But then their manager, a guy called Andrew Loog Oldham, thought that Ian Stewart looked too normal, and he didn't want 6 people in the band. He thought 6 people was too much. So he kind of sidelined Ian Stewart, and he became their road manager. And he played piano in most of their albums until he died in 1985. They loved him. They absolutely loved the guy, right? So he talked about that, and then I got to the crux of what he was so angry about, and it was this story about, you know, the defibrillator supposed to be, and I think the headline was "Start Me Up," so that went down like the proverbial lead balloon that, you know, they were suggesting that the Rolling Stones were just minutes away from pegging out, you know, live on stage in front of 10,000 people at the SEC. And it was actually a very good story because the tour director, who was a guy called Michael Cole, when the Rolling Stones had been rehearsing for that tour, they had a guitar roadie. I can't remember what the guy's name was, and he had taken a heart attack during rehearsals and basically fell down in front of them and had a heart attack and died. And Michael Cole quite rightly thought, you know, in any Rolling Stone show, there's maybe 250, 300 people moving from city to city. And then when we get to a city, we recruit another 150 people on the ground. So potentially on any Rolling Stone show, there's something like 450 people working on one single show. At some stage in the game, somebody's going to have an accident or maybe have a heart attack. And, you know, we should be equipped for that. So he bought 2 defibrillators. Sadly, it wasn't able to, you know, save the life of the guitar roadie who died. But, you know, he had them and they carried them with him. And of course, the hope was that they'd never need to open them up and take them out of their metal cases and they would never have to use them. But, you know, so things like that, you know, things that you think are, this is not going to work out, and it does. And, you know, an interview that I talk in the book, maybe most famously in the book, I went to Milan to interview Grace Jones. And I hung about for 2 days. We went on the Saturday, and on the Friday night, unknown to me and the PR guy, she had gone out to a party with her entourage, and they hadn't get back until about 6 o'clock in the morning. And they took the phone off the hook and put the "Do Not Disturb" sign in the door and said, "We're not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Don't care who it is. Do not disturb." So we hung about Milan the whole of the Saturday, went sightseeing, went for lunch, went shopping. Got up on the Sunday morning, went for breakfast, went sightseeing again, did another bit of shopping, went for lunch. And then we got to like 6 o'clock, 6:30 at night, and we still hadn't seen her or spoken to anybody in our entourage. So we just basically had to throw in the towel. It was a complete and utter waste of time. And we were getting the taxi back from the hotel back to Milan airport to catch a flight to Heathrow at 9 o'clock or something. And we were actually down in reception, and we'd put our bags in the boot of the taxi, ready to go. We were just paying the extras, you know, the phone calls and stuff. And the phone in the reception desk went, and I just heard the guy saying, "Mr. Chalmers," that was the PR guy. "Mr. Chalmers, that's a call for you." And Murray took the call and he said, "What now? Hang on a minute." So he put his hand over the phone. He says, "That was Gracie's guy. She'll do the interview now." I says, "But we're going to the airport, we're leaving." He said, "Well, she'll do the interview now." So I said to the taxi driver, "How long have we got?" And he said, "It's a Sunday night. The traffic ain't going to be too busy, but you'd really need to be off and running in about 20 minutes. You're not going to catch your flight." So we went up to the room. Murray said, what would you want to do?" I said, "Well, I'd rather do something than do nothing. We've hung about here for 2 days and we've not even spoken to her, so I'd rather do something." So we went up to the suite, and I walked in, and it was carnage, absolute carnage. There was all these kind of semi-naked women, like supermodels, all lying about in the bed and the sofa and the floor and the carpet, and all these sort of amazing-looking guys that looked as if they just stepped out the Vogue magazine or something. The most handsome guys you ever saw in your life, lying about in various stages of undress. And on the ground, on the floor, there was sort of room service trays with half-eaten room service meals and bits of melon and empty bottles of champagne and empty bottles of vodka and whiskey and stuff like that. And I kind of did a cinematic pan around the room and I couldn't see Grace. And I thought, are we in the right room? Have we come to the wrong suite or something? And then this guy waved me over, a security guy waved me over to the bathroom door. And he said, if you want to interview her, she's having a bath. And I kept waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't a punchline. God. And she was lying in the bath. And he said, you're going to need to interview her in the bath. I went, right, let's go. So I walked in, I sat in the toilet seat and I put my tape machine on the bidet and she was lying in the bath and I interviewed her for 20 minutes. I just had to steam in. No pleasantries, just get steam in, ask her the questions and interviewed her in the bath. And then at the end of it, I said, people are not going to believe that I've interviewed you in your bath. And I said, can I get a photograph? Can I get a picture? Expecting the security guy to grab me by the scruff of the neck and throw me out, but he didn't. So I sat down on the toilet floor next to the bath and she kind of leaned out the bath all covered in soap suds and gave me a hug. And I got the picture. And then a few weeks later, she was appearing on the Dame Edna Every's chat show. Dame Edna had a chat show late night on STV, and my old man phoned me up, like, you've just been on TV, you've been mentioned on the telly and all that. And I was just at a gig, so I didn't see it. And of course, there wasn't any kind of iPlayer back then, so I didn't know anybody that had taped it, so I never saw it until fairly recently. Guy Garvey of Elbow does a great program on Sky Arts called From the Vaults with Guy Garvey. And it's a program of vintage clips from the ITV archive of all music clips of the Sex Pistols and the Clash and U2 and Roxy Music and David Bowie and Mark Bolan. Some that have only been screened once or some that have never been screened at all. And Grace Jones was the guest. They showed a clip of of Dame Edna show, and Grace Jones was the guest with Tony Curtis, and she actually talked about. She made it look as if I turned up. I was having a bath, and this guy, he just turned up to do the interview. He just turned up. I was having a bath, and he just showed up. She never told Dame Edna I'd been hanging about for 2 days, and and she said, and he was very nervous, which was true. And she says, but then when I relaxed, and that made him relax. And in one of the greatest ad libs of all time, Dame Edna went, "I bet you're pleased about that, dear." And then she said to all the other journalists when they found out wanted to interview her when she was in the bath, but she only ever did it with me. And then later on, I met her later on, a few years later, I was interviewing her in Birmingham, and I took the picture down, and she signed it for me. Oh, you're the guy from the bath. I remember. And she signed on it, splish splash. I was taking a bath. Love from Grace Jones. So you just get situations like that where you've just got to sort of go with the flow. You've not got time to prepare or gather your thoughts. You've just got to you've got 20 minutes. You've just got to steam in and get it done. And that's what happened with both Keith Richards and also Grace Jones.
Billy, I think, we could talk for hours and hours and hours with some of the questions that I've got for you and some of the stories and anecdotes that you've got. And I was going to say earlier on, when we were talking about your book, One Love, One Life, and stories from the stars that you've written. Excuse me. There's professional footballers that played in English Premier League that have written autobiographies by the time they're 23.
Yeah.
With the stories that you've had over the 45-year career that you've had, you could have quite comfortably have written a series of books by now. But I think it's fascinating. I mean, the stories that you'll have in that book, even the stories that probably haven't even made the book would be.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole bunch of stuff that we just couldn't put in because of space restrictions. I had a limited number of words. I think it was 80,000 to 100,000, and I gave them 110,000. And then they asked me to chop it down a bit, so I was able to get rid of 4,000. So I think you got 106,000 words or something like that. But there was a whole bunch of stories that about Wet, Wet, Wet and Annie Lennox and stuff like that. We just couldn't put in loads of Simple Minds stories. I couldn't put in just simply because we didn't have the space. But I don't know if there's a volume 2. I'm not quite sure. I've not really thought that far. But there was a whole load of stuff that we just didn't have the space to shoehorn it in.
That's quite incredible. But we always finish this podcast by asking our guests what their 3 key fundamentals are when it comes to how they communicate. So What would your sort of three key fundamentals be when it comes to communication in the line of work and the career that you've had?
I just think, as I said before, right at the start, do your homework and be professional, because you're 99.9% of the time you're dealing with professional people, whether they're rock stars or footballers or boxers or politicians. I've interviewed people in all those categories. So be professional and know your stuff, because if you don't, you're putting yourself out on a limb. And more importantly, it's really unprofessional and disrespectful towards them. I mean, if you're going to interview Mick Jagger, know your stuff, know what makes him tick, and have a great series of questions which will hopefully elicit a great series of answers, because this guy is one of the biggest stars in the world and remains one of the biggest stars in the world. The same with McCartney. So know your stuff and do your homework.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's just fantastic, Billy. It's been unbelievable listening to some of your stories. It's been such an insight, and I'm really, really happy that I've been able to get this time with you. And thank you so much for the insight that you've given. And